We're moving from broad issues of policy. We will now focus on the realities at a practice level of finding housing for people experiencing homelessness and keeping them stably housed. To lead this conversation, please welcome moderator Sham Manglik, Senior Program Officer, Housing Adults and Household Supports at Robin Hood.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks so much to Help USA for hosting this panel. Help USA has been an amazing thought partner and partner in practice to Robin Hood over the years. Is this mic working?
Speak into it.
Yeah. Yeah, Help USA has been an incredible partner to Robin Hood over the years, both as a thought partner and a partner in practice, so just incredibly happy to be here. We have an exceptional panel of experts today who are practitioners and have lived experience in the shelter and supportive housing system. You have their bios in front of you, so I'm not going to do detailed introductions, but just going down the list, we have Molly Park, Commissioner of the Department of Social Services, Kenny Burgo, CEO of the New York Apartment Association, Mark Hurwitz, principal of Mark Hurwitz Consulting LLC, Natalia Donahue, Family Services at Help USA, and Mr. Hardin, who's a resident of Help USA Supportive Housing. So the previous panel touched on this a bit, but there are about 86,000 households in New York City shelters run by the Department of Homeless Services. But just really want to highlight how incredibly lucky we are in New York City to have the City FEPS program. It's an incredibly powerful tool to move households out of shelter and into permanent housing. Last year, about 16,000 people moved into housing with a City FEPS voucher. So panelists today are going to discuss creative approaches that are being successfully implemented to facilitate and speed up these placements, and also provide some ideas on what could be done better to even improve this progress. So in the first half of this panel, we're going to focus on City FEPS, then we'll move to supportive housing. I'm going to be asking targeted questions to the panelists, but please just chime in. We really want it to be a conversation. So Commissioner Park, let's start with you. Can you set the stage for us? What does the landscape look like for households who are looking to exit shelter? What tools does the city have, and what's being done to keep people out of shelter to begin with?
Great. Thanks so much for having me and for the question. So let me start with just some basic data on what we are doing and on the City FEPS program. Connecting people who are experiencing homelessness to permanent housing is an enormous priority for me and for the agency, and we have been very, very focused on it. And you can see that commitment in our numbers. So in calendar year 24, as was just mentioned, we moved about 16,500 households out of shelter into subsidized housing, right? So that doesn't include moves to, when people went back to live with family or something like that. That was a 38% increase over calendar year 23, which was itself an increase, and so on. City FEPS is overwhelmingly the tool that we use to help households exit shelter. We've got about 54,000 households receiving City FEPS right now. We are the largest rental subsidy program in the country, except for NYCHA's Section 8 program, right? So every other Section 8 program in the country, Los Angeles, Chicago, other very big places are smaller than City FEPS. And City FEPS, I just want to make it very clear, is a 100% city tax levy funded program, right? So the city is really committed to this work. It's incredibly important. We would be in much worse shape without City FEPS, but it's also very challenging. A few years ago, we were spending about $230 million a year, and this year we're on track for about $1.2 billion. So it's a very significant program for the city. The way we've been able to increase it is a very deliberate strategy that encompasses many dozens of small projects, right? It's the 30% increase is the number that we shout from the rooftops, but it is really a reflection of incredible incrementalism and hard work by the folks on the ground. So we have a 4-pronged strategy that we're using to improve our shelter exits. One is really getting subsidies into the hands of everybody who is eligible for them, right? So for city FEPs, for example, that means you have to be on cash assistance if you're eligible for cash assistance. So really making sure that we're working with shelter providers to do that eligibility screening and to get people through the process for everybody. And you know, this is something where we're literally, you know, the mountain we're climbing is tenths of a percent, but every 1/10 of a percent that we can do is more people who can be eligible for city FEPs. But we're also working with NYCHA to get Section 8 into people's hands. We have some other subsidy programs, so really making sure that anybody who has a subsidy, you know, who is eligible for a subsidy has it. But subsidy is a necessary part of the equation. It is not, but it's not sufficient. And we have to think about housing supply. So that is the second prong of our strategy. We are not ordinarily thought of as a housing supply agency. We're the Department of Social Services, but it's a 1.4% vacancy rate. I'm not telling this room anything they don't know. If we don't think about where people are going to go, they aren't going to move. So there are a few things that we have done and are doing in that space. City FEPs can now be used anywhere in the state. That is obviously not actively adding to supply, but it is increasing the universe of units that are available for people experiencing homelessness in our shelters. And then we actually are adding to supply. So we have created a program called the Affordable Housing Services Program, which is essentially a project-based version of city FEPs. So not-for-profits can apply, get a contract. It is a 30-year contract that includes city FEPs rents, maintenance and operations, some maintenance and operations, and some light touch social services. And with that contract, not-for-profits have been able to acquire buildings, and those buildings are then used as affordable housing for people coming out of the shelter system for the term of that contract, so 30 years. I see some friends in the room who have done these or are doing these, and we're really excited about that initiative. The third piece of our strategy is increasing the number and quality of city FEPs packages that are coming into the agency. We have to do some level of process and screening, right? And we absolutely can and should talk about what the appropriate level of process and screening is, but it's not going to be zero. We, for example, look at the deed on an apartment before somebody can move in. We do that because people have scammed us in the past and represented themselves as landlords when they are not in fact the landlords, right? Like, I have to balance being a good steward of city resources in addition to getting people out into housing quickly. So how do we make sure that those packages are accurate and high quality from the get-go? I think this is a place where there is still an enormous amount of work to do. The vast majority of packages that we do get returned back to shelter providers for updating. I think some of that is an education and support question, and some of it is, are we doing things in a way that sort of actually intrinsically doesn't make sense, and we need to do it differently so that people don't make as many mistakes. So we're really spending a lot of time thinking about that. But we have done a lot of training. We created a City FEPS boot camp, right? An in-person training where city housing, shelter housing specialists can come and really get trained on that. We have what we call our concierge team, where we are sending DHS staff out to work with some of the lower performing in this particular aspect of performance, lower performing shelters, right? Helping them to learn the process and build the skills so that they can do it on their own. So, and then the fourth prong of our initiative is really making sure that we as an agency are doing everything that we can, that we are making our own operations run efficiently. So that can be, dropping paperwork that we have decided isn't necessary. We've gone from, 17 attachments to 12 on the City FEPS package, making things last longer before they're stale. We have an end-to-end subsidy processing system that is out to virtually all shelters at this point, and we're now engaging landlords as well. One of the things that we changed, this is, I think, a very good example of, where incrementalism contributes to really big change. A piece of our process we called clearance. It was looking at the administrative records associated with a unit, right? Does the building have violations? Who owns it? All of these things. Our staff were doing it manually, so they would go to HPD and look up the violations, and then they would go to DOB and look up the violations, and it took forever. And if you failed one piece on the 12-step process, you went all the way back to the beginning, and it was crazy. The number of on-the-ground housing specialists who told me that this was their pain point was staggering, because it is such a nitty-gritty piece of the process. And so we've automated that, and it's being done in now about 24 hours. So we have to make sure that our own house is in shape as well. So we do see, I think, results from all of these things. I mentioned the big uptick in movements. On average, fully acknowledge that there's variation around that average, but on average it's about 3 weeks from the point in time that we receive to the package until a household is able to move out. There's absolutely still work to do. Running through these 4 prongs is something that I actually was supposed to do this afternoon, but we're moving the time because we're running late. But it's something that we're still very focused on as an agency. Just to put a little bit more on sort of current landscape, I cannot stress enough the role that supply plays in helping, and housing supply and housing access in the pace at which people are going to be able to either exit shelter or avoid shelter, right? There are 11,000 households in DHS shelter right now with a City FEPS shopping letter, which is sort of the start of the process, meaning we've said, we think you meet the preliminary eligibility requirements, go out, find an apartment. So 11,000 households are searching for an apartment with a subsidy and can't find one right now, right? So housing supply is incredibly important. I think some of the zoning changes that came out of City of Yes are going to be really important. There's other things there are things that are happening that I think in the long run will help. And then the last thing before I've talked a lot, I'm sorry, but is that we are as an agency really thinking about diversion and how we can help people avoid coming into shelter in the first place. A data point that I'm just fascinated by and really thinking about how we can mimic this is particularly in the early days of the pandemic, families with children intake plummeted. And it was exactly the opposite of what I thought was going to happen, right? You have families, they're doubled up, and now they're home 24/7, and being close to people is dangerous. I was sure that was going to result in big spikes in demand, and it didn't, in exactly the opposite. And some of that has to do with families coming together in moments of crisis, but I think a lot of it had to do with the emergency federal income supports that made it actually financially viable for people to stay in the living situations in which they were in. So what can we do to support families and individuals before they come into shelter so that they don't need to come into shelter? There's a variety of different things that we're thinking about there. One that I'm really excited about that we're starting this summer on a pilot basis is what we call Project Crib, which is to serve pregnant people who are applying for shelter to try and see if we can avoid having babies born in shelter. We know there's lots of data that supports that early childhood homelessness is associated with a whole slew of adverse impacts. So we're starting a pilot this summer where a set number of households will get City FEPS at the front door. Pregnant people applying for shelters will get City FEPS. Some will get Pathway Home, which is another subsidy that we have for that pays people to stay with friends or family. Some people will come into the shelter system as they would normally do and really look at what we can do to reduce the number of shelter nights used and as I say, hopefully avoid babies being born into homelessness. And we will use those findings to guide policy going forward.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Park. The changes you're implementing are really impressive, and I'm really, in particular, excited about the upstream work. Robin Hood hopes to support some of this in the upcoming year. So, Kenny, I'm going to turn to you. So your organization represents owners of rent-stabilized housing. These owners are key to people actually moving with a voucher into an actual unit. We often hear that the housing inspection process is a pain point for landlords. Can you talk about these challenges and what's being done to make it easier? And in general, what more can be done to support landlords to expand the pie of housing units available to voucher holders?
Sure, thank you. And to set the stage, I'll add, so rent stabilization accounts for about 40% of the rental housing market within New York City. It's 2.3 million rentals, almost 1 million rent stabilized units. So we recognize the significance and importance of us as partners in this housing conversation, and we're proud to do so. There's about 100,000 voucher holders already within rent-stabilized units, some of them using Section 8, others using other vouchers like city FEPs. And what you're speaking about is an actual, it's a real problem that we have, and working with the commissioner and partners to certainly fix this, right? I don't want to trivialize it, but inspections matter, right? This is, again, like to use the commissioner's point, this is not saying we shouldn't do any inspections, because that process absolutely matters to make sure people have safe and quality and abundant housing. But what we're seeing in some of our owners is that some of these inspections can fail for some really almost comedic things, if you will. I mean, I've heard of a case of an inspection failing for a cracked outlet plate. And again, that can pose a danger, but this is a 25-cent outlet plate that can be fixed probably in 30 minutes, but unfortunately starts the inspection cycle all over again. There's other parts of the inspection process where the hot water is required to be between is it 121 degrees and 128 degrees, I believe? So it has to fall within that range, and you have one individual inspector going out, and this is not to speak poorly on inspectors, but sometimes if you all live in buildings, hot water can take a few minutes to kind of kick back up, right? So who's to say that hot water didn't need 5 minutes to sort of get to that optimal range? So these are just some of those small little pieces, but that can really cause hiccups when you scale it up to a city of this size, when you scale it up to the amount of people who have vouchers, and when you scale it up to the huge crisis of trying to house people in the city of New York.
Great. Commissioner Park, I know the city is doing a lot on inspections. Can you add to that?
Yeah, and I think this is something that we recognize, and so we are taking another look at our inspection standards. We have to have something, right? And there needs to be taking the hot water, right? There needs to be a temperature guidance, because we can't have people say, making their own judgment. And I should take a step back. The way we do inspections for units that are going to be leased with city FEPs, it can be DHS staff. It is more often shelter staff who are doing those inspections, right? So we need to be able to give people a very clear checklist that says this is okay and that's not okay, and there needs to be something. But we hear that what is really truly a health and safety matter and what isn't is something that we should be looking at. So we're engaging with the Department of Buildings and other partner agencies to make sure that should we need to do a refresh of our inspection standards, that is something that we can do. There's I suspect we will never get away from the crazy examples, because since we do have to have a checklist, there's going to always be something that is just outside the bounds of what's okay, but we can minimize that. Something else that we've done during COVID, we started doing virtual inspections. So we have a DHS staff person on one end of FaceTime and like a broker or something like that on the other end of FaceTime. We were doing, and we continued doing that with DHS staff, but we've now made that available for providers as well, so that we're able to do virtual inspections to facilitate that, and hopefully if something does need to be corrected, it's easier to do the follow-up inspection.
Great, thank you so much. Mark, through your consulting practice, you have a great perspective on models that are being successfully used in other parts of the country that are also now being brought to New York. I'm thinking Anthos Home, but maybe there are others. Can you talk a little bit about how those innovations can help address some of the issues that the panelists have already brought up and perhaps others?
Yes, thanks. I will talk about Anthos Home. And like probably most people in this room, I think this is the greatest city in the world. And I think one of the reasons is that we're not afraid to look at innovations from elsewhere and make them part of our city. And that's really the story of Anthos Home, which started across the country in LA, which is now rivaling New York for being the epicenter of homelessness. And they realized about 10 years ago that especially they don't have right to shelter in their playbook. So they really had to tap into the private rental market. And what they decided to do was to create essentially a white glove broker service for homeless people. And it started because if you are a voucher holder, and they didn't have a city FEP, so they were mostly talking about Section 8 vouchers. If you are a voucher holder and you're competing for an apartment, it's kind of like trying to get a job without a resume. And it's illegal in LA. It may not have been 10 years ago, but it's illegal there and here to discriminate against someone because they have a voucher, source of income discrimination. But it's not illegal to discriminate because it's going to take several months of paperwork or because somebody doesn't have references or a credit rating. So that made it really, really rough for people with vouchers to get housing. And so the Department of Public Health, and I think that's really telling, that the Department of Public Health teamed together with a private foundation to create a program, and they put $18 million into it. They put out an RFP, and a group called Brilliant Corners was chosen to run this. It's been around, as I said, 10 years, and they've housed over 14,000 people, and they're up to about 2,500 people a year. And this was brought to New York, in fact, with seed funding from Robinhood, which funds kind of best-in-class nonprofits that are social innovators, by Laura Lazarus, who's here with a couple team members from Anthos, and Leslie Abbey. And they started it up in New York, and in 2 years are doing incredible work. They have partnerships with ACS for high-risk youth coming out of foster care. They're also about to launch work with New York's newly formed social care networks, which has billions of dollars of Medicaid funding and will actually pay for, among other things, housing search. It'll pay for food, it'll pay for transportation for vulnerable people who are on Medicaid managed care. And really, Anthos Home is just singularly focused on helping voucher holders of any kind, and there are, maybe up to 10 different kinds of vouchers in New York, to get into housing and stay into housing. And the way they've done that is to not only focus on the homeless person. The homeless person is where it all starts, but a homeless person cannot get into housing if you don't also understand the landlord's point of view. And so Anthos has a whole team that just goes out, pounds the pavement. Many of the people on the team are former brokers, or they really understand New York landlords and New York real estate, and they have a lot in their toolkit. They'll pay for that outlet cover or more to avoid a month delay in an inspection. They'll really help the landlord understand that the tenant is coming with Anthos Home as a partner. That tenant will really understand what the lease signing means, and will have continuing aftercare to continue to be a good tenant and a good neighbor in the building. they have essentially created a supply pool of housing that meets the demand of the tenants that they're working with. So if they are, as they are right now, a little short on one bedrooms compared to the number of people, voucher holders that have come to them, they'll be looking for one bedrooms. And so that supply pool or housing bank allows someone with a voucher to move in right away because the landlord's already agreed to hold the unit for a voucher holder. And that cuts the time. I love that it's taking 3 weeks, but getting up to that period can take many months. And so they've cut the total time down to several months, which is very impressive considering the amount of bureaucracy that there is. They have been scaling up. Last month, Anthos tenants or prospective tenants viewed 174 apartments. Those probably aren't all going to result in move-ins, but you can get the idea of the scale that's starting to build up with this program. They, as I said earlier, they make sure the tenant is ready, but they also have aftercare. And because of both the tenant readiness and the aftercare and the smart matching to housing, in 2 years they have 100% housing stability rate. The only people who have moved out to better things. So that's a little snapshot of it, and that's all for now.
Yeah, no, that's so great. And Kenny, I know many of your members have worked with Anthos Home, and it's such a key part of their model is the aftercare they provide to landlords. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and what you see as the value add of this type of organization?
Certainly, yeah. Anthos has been a great partner, and I think it's an excellent model, given what we're hearing and sort of the obstacles we have right now when housing in New York City. What I'll say, there's two pieces here, right? One, we're going to continue to harp on because it's just that critically important. It's supply. When you talk about the supply issue, right now we have some of our owners, when an apartment goes online, 5 to 10 voucher holders at minimum, and on top of that, you're probably going to have a line around the corner, which you've probably seen on the internet, of individuals trying to get, especially some really coveted rent-stabilized apartments in certain parts of the city, right? That just speaks to the huge supply issue we have, and when the average rent-stabilized apartment is $1,300 compared to a market rate apartment, which in Manhattan can be upwards of $5,000, the competition becomes incredibly fierce. You layer that in on top of the fact that owners will be using brokers, right? So now there's this other party in this process, and this is where owners sort of lose control, not just of the narrative, but of the process, where owners are to blame, if you will, for essentially what happens, and they're responsible. It's their unit. But when brokers are having open listings and there's multiple brokers trying to bring people to a certain unit, it's just very hard to control and police what is happening there. So I think what Anthos is doing is certainly helping not only to level that playing field and helping out voucher holders get that timely apartment and move as quick as possible, but again, we as housing providers are more than happy and willing to get anyone in that apartment willing to be housed and make sure, to pay the rent and keep it, in a good condition. This is exactly what we want to have in New York City, but it's about filling these gaps, and I think Anthos does a great job of that.
Thank you so much. So Natalia, I'm going to turn to you. You are working on the front lines with individuals who are seeking housing. Can you tell us a little bit about what the secret sauce is to actually have a stable housing placement and move someone into permanent housing? We've talked about city FEPs. If you could talk about that and other programs that you think are particularly effective or ones that you think need to be improved.
So housing starts at the front door. So particularly for us as a provider, we ensure that all staff works together as a team to best assist our families into getting housing opportunities. If a staff member, whether it's from maintenance or safety staff, case management, if they see anything, any ads about any housing opportunities, they inform our housing team, which our housing team will actually, look into and see if, this apartment is accepting the City for HEPS program or any of the programs that, the client could qualify for. The housing team, basically, they do an intake with our clients, and when they're doing their intake, they're also exploring all the housing options that these clients can qualify for. And while they're doing that, they also are assisting the clients in completing applications, where it's housing applications with Housing Connect, NYCHA, doing a homeless housing application as well, and encouraging clients to apply for many other low-income apartments. They also encourage many of the potential eligible clients that can qualify for a City PEPS voucher to start seeking for apartments, because like Kenny said, there's a competition. So because there's a competition, we can't wait for a client to have a voucher and then start looking for apartments. Our housing specialists are already actively searching for apartments, but at the same time that they're searching for apartments, they're also networking with not just only like staff, but they're networking with the community, networking with brokers, real estate agencies, superintendents, landlords, and even management offices. When our clients are applying for like Housing Connect applications, when they get contacted, our housing specialists, what they do is they outreach the housing agents, and they say, and they advocate for our clients, stating that they can, they could assist them in providing them with, like how the process works and anything that, that is needed for that particular family member or client. At the same time, it's also being clear and transparent as far as how the program works, whether it's with a management company, a broker, a landlord. We have to be clear on how the program works, how long the process takes, and that there could be hiccups. 3 weeks, yes, it takes 3 weeks once it's, once the package has been, submitted, but it could take longer than 3 weeks before putting a package together. So it's continuously informing like our families as far as like how the process works while they're in shelter. We do, during their meetings, during house meetings, and during the duration of, the client's stay in the shelter, they are consistently being informed of how the City for HEPS program works, and that it's not like a 1, 2, 3, and it's not a guarantee that they're gonna get these apartments right away. I also want to say that, like I said, I think it is a lot of networking that our housing specialists are doing, but it's doing it in a consistent and a professional manner, and always being up to date with any changes that can occur with the program or any programs that the city offers. At the same time, it's also being on top and following up with brokers, with landlords, with managing agencies, and even, like with other providers as far as like what's going on with the client's apartment.
Great. Commissioner Park, I was wondering if you could jump in. You mentioned some changes the city's implemented to improve this experience for housing specialists. Can you talk a little bit more about what those are?
Sure. I think some of this is work we've done. Some of it is work that we're doing. We've created an enormous amount of training, done a lot. Hopefully, it has worked for your team, but to make sure that we are providing clear guidance on how the process is supposed to go. One of the things that I think we've heard and that we are continuing to work on is that we need to make it simpler and cleaner and have materials that we can use that are just very transparent for somebody who may not have gone through the training or who went through the training 2 years ago, right? So making sure that we have solid checklists, making sure that all of those training materials are readily available and not something that you have to search out. That there is, we've done very basic things. We now have office hours twice a week where shelter staff can call in and get help either with how do I do something conceptually or help me work through an issue on a package. So it's really a combination of making sure that we are giving people the tools that they need to be able to do it on their own, and making our staff as accessible as possible, so that when there are hiccups or unusual circumstances, right? When say we moved 16,500 households into subsidized housing last year. Even if you only have 5% of them that run into issues, that's an awful lot of issues, right? So we need to make sure that we are there and are good partners so that we can work through whatever the boutique hiccup that comes along.
Thank you so much for that. And now we're going to pivot to supportive housing. We've talked a lot about what the journey looks like from shelter to permanent housing on kind of the administrative side. But Mr. Hardin, I really want to turn to you. If you could just walk us through your journey from shelter to supportive housing and kind of what worked, what didn't, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. The transition from when I've been to like 3 different shelters, and it was really challenging, dealing with, because most people that, that don't have a place to stay, that's homeless, they go through a lot of issues mentally or just being down on your luck. And to find shelter and somewhere to stay and have your privacy and not going through, the things that, that have you down, or concentrate the things that have you down on your luck in life. So it was like one of the best days of my life, to get my own place with Help One and Build to Be, to get with people like Mr. Victor and his staff to help us with, anything that we needed to be done. They're real helpful. So.
Great, thank you. Natalia, can you talk a little bit, what is Mr. Hardin's experience similar to those of the clients you work with, and are there pain points that you wish you could change to make this process and experience faster or better?
So it's definitely listening to our clients and making sure that, we are hearing them on their needs. One of the things that I would say that would help out with the pathway to supportive housing to make it easier for our clients is removing the 1-year homelessness requirement. I say that because it could allow some clients to qualify for supportive housing. At times we have clients with mental health or substance abuse issues who may be able to be placed and suitable for an environment like that, but because they don't meet that homeless requirement of the year, they don't qualify. In addition, we also have clients who have been street homeless, and they could be disqualified because they cannot remember their whereabouts, dates, times. So this is also like an issue that we find when we try to get these clients to qualify for supportive housing.
Thank you. Mark, I see you nodding. I know you have deep experience in the supportive housing space. What would you add in terms of challenges? And I know you've also spoken about how the city's working to optimize the supportive housing stock. So if you could speak to that too, that would be really helpful.
Sure. I think supportive housing is really the single best solution to homelessness. So we've got to make the most of it, and making the most of it comes down to, I think, 3 things. One is if there's a vacant unit, that means somebody's on the street and not in that unit. So we've got to fill vacancies quickly. The second is, the earlier panel just talked about, there's not enough housing. It's a game of musical chairs. So we have to prioritize, and we have to make sure that those units that are vacant go to people who need them the most. Then I think the third thing is stability. We don't want to perpetuate a revolving door by making a poor match or having someone fail. That could actually be traumatic and cause them to not trust maybe next time. Could be a learning experience too. We're not going to have 100% success, but we have to make a good match. And so in terms of prioritizing people, that's why the city has spent, I know, over a decade sort of developing and refining a coordinated intake system called CAPS. And that is controversial, I think, especially among people on the front lines, because it feels a little bureaucratic and controlling. But I'm actually a real fan of it, because otherwise we would have, there's the pitchers and the catchers, and HELP is one of those organizations that, a shelter I think of as, you're working with Mr. Harden in shelter, and you're trying to pitch to a housing provider, and then the housing provider is the catcher who says, yes, we want to fill our unit, but we have our own requirements, and we want to make sure that person pays rent, is a good neighbor, et cetera. And, without CAPS, we would be in the battle days, which I remember at DHS, which was that you had to be clean and sober for 30 days before you would even be considered for housing. And so there were a lot of people who couldn't get to that, partly because they were in this chaotic environment of shelter, who were stuck in shelter for decades. And that's where the focus, the groundbreaking work on who comes into shelter, the episodic and the chronic focus on chronic homelessness, which is where the one-year thing comes from. So I would say be careful, because CAPS has done a lot, just not only chronicity, because it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't have been there for a year, if you could have moved out quickly. So now you're just sort of building up your time. But they also, looking at functional assessment, they're looking at the frequent use of systems, including the health system, which also can suck dollars that could have been used for housing, the incarceration system. So it's pretty sophisticated. I'm sure it could be improved. One of the things they do is they say to providers, you don't get zero choice, you get 1 in 3. We will refer 3 people. I see some people shaking their heads. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're not doing that anymore. It's been about a year since I've been involved. But I think there is some room, and I don't know how, but there may be some room to be more flexible about that, because it gets to the point of vacancies. And some providers have 0 vacancies. Some have 10 or 15% or higher vacancies. And that was looked at a couple years ago. And I really have to give credit to Molly and her team, because they drove the vacancy rate in supportive housing down from 9% to, I think, about 4.5%. And I think that represents maybe over 1,500 units of housing. And if there were 1,500 units of new housing built, the mayor and all the CEOs and all the city council people would be there at the ribbon cutting. So we really have to have some kind of equivalent for that kind of great work. And I can tell you from the provider's point of view a little bit about what that work looks like. I worked at Urban Pathways, and our CEO, Fred Shack, said, I want a vacancy report daily, So, and vacancies is a great measure of not only are you filling your units fast, it's actually a mathematical relation between that, how time to fill, and also how many people are leaving. So if you're doing well on stability and on time to fill, you will have a low vacancy rate. And I would say that every CEO or program director, look at your vacancy rate. If it's over 4.5%, you're contributing to the problem. If it's under 4.5%, you're actually helping. I think it could get a lot lower. I don't know if it can get down to the 1.4% of the whole city, but I think it could get down to 4, 3, 2% average in the city, which would be another hundreds of units of housing. The way to do that is to map out the housing journey, both from the unit point of view and the tenant point of view, and to look at the milestones along that, to measure those, and to say, our time to fill is too high because we're getting stuck between point B and point C. Also, most organizations have done this, but if you centralize your housing intake, you will then be more efficient at some of the things like low-income housing tax credit paperwork that probably most of the housing needs. I think, there are some sticking points that anyone who's worked in this knows. When an apartment is sealed, you got to know why. Is it NYPD? Is it surrogate court? You got to come up with some really good ideas about how do you convince that surrogate court that, you've sent 5 registered letters to the next of kin and haven't got back, so that it's really time to unseal that apartment. On the unit journey, the property management team needs they need to feel the pressure to turn that unit over and make those repairs, make sure they have stock of things so they don't have a supply chain problem for that, new refrigerator. On the client side, I think we've got to reduce the no-show rate and act like, my dentist office, there is no way I'm going to forget my appointment. I'm getting 5 texts, they're calling me, when I get there, I'm seen right away by someone who's, got a smile. So I think that both the shelter providers and the housing providers have to work together to reduce the no-show rate and figure out if people are missing interviews, why. And I think the last thing I'll just say about this is that Housing First is now becoming kind of a national issue, and Housing First is vulnerable as an idea because communities are saying, this is scary, I don't get this. Why is someone with an active substance use problem going to be living in that, that building on my block or that vacant lot on my block, and I'm gonna, as we heard earlier, I'm gonna go to a meeting and I'm gonna say no. And I think what we have to do is really look at once someone comes into housing, because we aren't saying you have to be clean and sober for 30 days. A practice called motivational interviewing, which a lot of case managers are trained in, is really about building trust and making it feel, and this is very hard, and sometimes it's not going to happen, but making it feel like if you're a case manager, you're not there to say gotcha. You can talk to me about your using, like literally, what drugs are you using, when, how, and talk to me about why you're not paying rent. And if you don't have that trust, then it gets contentious. It ends up in housing court, and it ends up with evictions, which is exactly the opposite of what we want.
All right. I want to chime in. I want to start with actually a couple of announcements on the supportive housing side that I think are good news. The first and the really big one, which was the mayor announced on Monday, but some of the press coverage was a little bit murky, so I'm going to go into the wonky version of the details here, is a refresh of the 1515 program to reposition it for going forward. So, 1515 was originally conceived of as 7,500 units of scatter site and 7,500 units of congregate. Congregate in this context meaning, buildings that are supportive housing, but individual units. Perhaps not surprisingly, in a city with a 1.4% vacancy rate, the scatter site program was very, very challenging to implement. So we're at a place right now where we've done awarded 19% of the scatter site units, and I think something like 115% of the congregate units. So we are flipping that balance. It's going to be, don't quote me on these exact numbers, but something like a total of 1,600 scatter site units, and the remainder of the 15,000 units will be congregate. So this is a commitment to continue to develop supportive housing well into the future. It's incredibly important. A lot of people in this room worked really hard on getting us to this point. So this is a tremendous announcement that we should be really excited about. The other change, and this has been much more under the radar screen and is much more technical, but I think will resonate with this audience, is that we recently rolled out some changes to 1515 eligibility to count certain amounts of time in either the correction system or hospital towards the definition of chronic homelessness. And and I think both of the previous speakers address this well, right? We have a real challenge, right? Supportive housing is a scarce resource. We do need to make sure that we are getting it to really high needs clients. We do need to find ways that we can prioritize, but we were also seeing instances where people were literally being discharged from the hospital in order to accrue the remaining necessary time for supportive housing eligibility. So we think that the changes that we've made hit the right balance, where we're still focusing on people who have a long experience of either unsheltered or sheltered homelessness, but recognizing the fact that for many people they will be moving across systems, and that we should account for that. And I want to pivot a little bit to talk about the vacancy rate. And thank you, Mark, for the credit. Appreciate it. It's a DSS team effort for sure, along with many colleagues in this room. But we tend to talk about supportive housing as if it is a monolith, right? That all 36,000 units of supportive housing that exist in the city of New York are sort of more or less the same. In fact, they were built and developed over many different regulatory environments, many different funding streams, different agencies have supervisory responsibility, and all of that hugely affects the vacancy rate. And so when you start to peel it apart, if you look at the housing that, when most of us think about supportive housing, we are thinking about the buildings that are getting built right now, either with 1515 subsidy or ESHI subsidy from the state, where people have a unit with, a small unit, but they've got a kitchen and a bathroom, and then there's some beautiful amenity space, and they're paying 30% of their income in rent, and that is what we're doing now. And the vacancy rate on those is essentially churn, right? We don't have a meaningful vacancy rate on those. But then you start to peel back all of these different layers and what you have underneath that. So you have a lot of old SRO units, right? So people don't have their own kitchen and bathroom. They have a kitchen and bathroom down the hall. And it is, you don't necessarily have the same beautiful community space. You have shared units, right? So you are actually in a, it's labeled supportive housing, but it is an apartment, and, we're roommates, but we didn't know each other until last week, and that's really challenging. This is one that is certainly a bit of a bee in my bonnet, but some of the state Office of Mental Health sites, which include some of the shared units and SROs, but the way that the rent structure is tenants are expected to sign over their SSI check and then get an allowance back. So they are effectively paying 70% of their income in rent. It is an entirely rational thing to say, I am going to wait for a studio apartment where I pay 30% of my income in rent, and I don't want that shared unit or that SRO or that unit where I'm going to be paying 70% of their income in rent. Mark talked about making sure that units are a good match, and I think that has, that matching process and reflecting what is a, as I say, completely reasonable set of client preferences is, it is a big piece of the vacancy rate, right? Which is, again, there's always ways that we can look at further tightening, and these are conversations that we're having all the time, but I think it is expecting those shared units, the SRO units, to have the same kind of process flow as what we now think of as a classic supportive housing unit is probably unrealistic. One of the things that was included in the 1515 repositioning is some funding for supportive housing preservation. So I think this may be a place where we can invest in some of these buildings that have been, that need a little love, and where we may be able to improve things going forward.
Great, these are exciting updates, and really appreciate the nuance. I think it's time for questions. Does anyone have any? There's one hand up front.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Monique Mitchell. I'm an executive director at Wanna Help USA Single Adult Female Shelters, and I have a two-part question for you, Ms. Commissioner Park. There's a program called Special Supplemental Assistance Fund, and it pays up to $3,000 in arrears or damages for clients. Will there be any programs introduced to help landlords with needs before clients move in to stop the inspections from failing?
Great question. So, short answer is yes. We are working on something on that. I'm not gonna break news here because because we're. That's a separate program, actually. I'll let you talk about that one. But we at DSS are working on something, actually with our colleagues at Anthos, to think about what some of the repair needs are in apartments. So stay tuned. We should be announcing something very, very soon there. But Kenny, why don't you talk about unlocking doors?
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. So one of the ways in which the city and property owners have certainly partnered, and I thank the Commissioner for recognizing this housing stock being so incredibly old and falling apart and need a lot of investment, right? Again, rent-stabilized housing tends to be sometimes older than our subway system. These are, walk-ups. These are 100-year-old buildings. They need lots of investment, which is what I've also should have added when you talk about inspections. It's very difficult sometimes to match those inspections just because of the pure age of these buildings. So one of the programs the city has put out in recent years was called Unlocking Doors, which was a $25,000 grant program in order to put some investment into these units to try and get them unlocked. Recently, the city has actually doubled that amount in recognition that the cost is a bit more substantial than $25,000 in a city like New York City. Even by HPD's own cost schedule, I mean, the amount to turn over a unit can be in the thousands, sometimes the hundreds of thousands. And again, we want to be partners here, right? But the math has to make sense, right? We have to sort of make these keys and these locks work together. So I think these are one of these programs that we can build upon and make sure that we're making sure these units come online and we can get tenants placed immediately.
Amazing. Because some of the things I've noticed is that inspections will pass and then 30 days later clients will reach out and say the stove is not working or something is inoperable. And so I also wanted to ask, will there be programs such as aftercare where clients are being checked in with after they moved out just to see where they are and what they need?
So we don't have aftercare for everybody leaving the shelter system. And I think there's evidence both from our own program and then lots of academic research that for overwhelming majority of people who are experiencing homelessness, the reason that they're homeless is because rent is really damn high in New York City, and that when they have an affordable place to live, that they will be okay. And we certainly want to encourage people to advocate for themselves, right? It is a landlord's responsibility to make sure that the stove works, right? So, calling your landlord, calling 311. We do provide aftercare through our home-based offices. So, and in that case, right, a client does need to take the initiative to engage with home-based, but we, provide aftercare services to, I want to say it's something like 19,000 households a year who do approach us through home-based. I mentioned earlier the Affordable Housing Services Program, and that we are doing, which is essentially the project-based city FEPS contract, and I'm excited about that one from a housing finance perspective because I'm a nerd, but also because I do think it fills a critical gap in the city's housing stock where we do have, we have a lot of housing where it's here, we've made it affordable for you, have at it, right? And then we have supportive housing, which is very, very rich and clinically oriented services, and we don't have much in between for somebody who might be struggling a little bit but doesn't have the same kind of clinical needs for supportive housing. AHS does that, right? So there are on-site social services. They are a much lighter touch than in supportive housing, but they exist. And I was at a ribbon cutting for one of those projects. I guess this was last summer, last fall. And one of the speakers was a tenant who, he was 21. He'd been in the shelter system for a couple of years. He had no local family. This was his first real lease, and he was never going to qualify for supportive housing, nor did he need supportive housing. On the other hand, as a 21-year-old, I certainly wasn't prepared to be completely self-sufficient. Like, I called my mom to tell her, for her to tell me to do all kinds of things. He didn't have that kind of familial safety net, but now he had that same kind of safety net from the building. So I do think that thinking about that missing middle on the service side is something that we're trying to do.
Thank you.
I see a hand over there.
Hi, I think it's afternoon, yes it is. My name is Yvonne Soto, I'm the Director of Special Projects at Exponents. And my department, we complete 2010E applications so that we can assist chronically homeless individuals, people coming out of jail or prison, individuals who are suffering with severe mental illness or phasing out of drug treatment, get supportive housing. The problem that I'm having, as you stated, it's a difficult process to get that application completed. Sometimes you have to do it 2 and 3 times before they approve it through the PAC portal. Now the issue is once they get an approval for supportive housing, is to find the placement for them. And so we end up losing people who have struggled all this time to get that approval, only to wait 6, 9, maybe 12 months to get placed. And sometimes they end up back in prison or lost to follow-up because we can no longer find them because they left the drug treatment program, or they're going through an episode, struggling with their mental illness. So I was trying to figure out what can we do to help expedite this process, maybe a little bit more than just waiting a year for someone to get placed.
I think the first thing we need to do is create more supportive housing, right? Are there process issues that we can work through? Absolutely, and I'm always happy to collaborate with people, as you identify particular pain points, like we're ears. But I think the biggest issue is the supply of housing and how that supply matches up with both demand and individual client preferences and needs. And Mark talked about making sure that we have a good match and so that we have housing stability. This is something, it was many years ago at this point that I was at HPD, but where it was one of those if we respect people's borough of preference, it's going to be a much better, placement match. Oh, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And there's a few other things. We can't put somebody with mobility needs in the 4th floor walk-up, right? If somebody is a domestic violence survivor, are there safety preclusions that mean that they can't be in a particular borough, right? So these are all things that we have to think of. And then the overlay, as I mentioned, where we have much higher vacancy rates in shared units and SROs, which are not going to be a decent fit for all clients. So, I think we are working to fill units and to make matches as quickly as possible, but the demand significantly outstrips the supply, and that matching process of making sure that it will be a good fit does take a little bit of time. So again, I am happy to talk about particular pain points because I am a believer that we can always do things better than we're doing them now, but I do think that the supply is the overwhelming issue.
Great. I think we're at time, so maybe come find the panelists if you have burning questions afterwards. But everyone, if you could just join me in thanking our amazing panel today.